potential for fear. The researchers found that it's not required for fear and panic evoked by CO2. And the increase in panic attacks might suggest that amygdala may inhibit fear. And then what points did the researchers bring up about this? Does anyone remember?
See, this is exactly what I don't want to see. What? So first of all, the only person who responded to the first question, which is a really obvious question, and everybody should know the answer to it. What was it again? Back up. What are the big takeaways here? So somebody volunteer what you think the big message is about this study. What was the thing, like with relation to the hypothesis, what did they find? And what does that say?
Despite the fact that the amygdala was damaged, they were still able to be fearful or to experience fear, which the initial hypothesis was that they didn't think they'd be able to.
So that tells us
that the amygdala is not the only thing that causes fear. Or
the feeling of fear, right?
Feeling of fear.
Okay. So go ahead and you can start.
The chemoreceptors, I think it said in the article, because of the intake of CO2 causes a physiological reaction. So it's not just the amygdala that's causing this issue that's sending out signals that there's a problem, it's actual chemoreceptors.
Yeah, exactly.
So are you almost at the end, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you guys should just turn around and start, doing whatever thing you're going to do. And you had a question or a commentary, right?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, kind of like what Nick said, that it's a difference between the external and internal stimuli. So they're responding to the external stimuli of being prepared for something, and that's what's making them nervous. Whereas with the CO2, they're responding to the internal stimuli and physiological changes.
Yeah, and they state that in a lot of other studies that they've done with these 3 patients, that all the stimuli for fear was all external, so it was like vision or pictures, but this one is an internal fear, so they think it goes through a different pathway than the previous studies, and so kind of brings up the big question of what's the difference between internal and external stimuli, and how does it maybe go through the amygdala, or what other parts it goes through that affect whether or not they experience fear. And that was pretty much it. Yeah.
I just need a clarification on, I know that the paper said that the amygdala may inhibit what's on the slide? Panic, yeah. But I wasn't quite sure what they meant by that, because it looked like they had panic from CO2. So I was just confused about what they were really saying.
I took it as, I don't know if this is right, but that they typically do not experience fear, at least from external sources, but they're still able to experience it through internal sources. I don't know.
So did you say that these 3 patients didn't exhibit panic attacks in previous studies?
Yeah.
When they were giving them, like, showing them scary things or
Yeah.
threatening them in some way? Okay. So what does that say about the potential function of the amygdala?
Well, with respect to the external versus internal, whatever stimuli, I think that kind of makes more sense why only 3 of the non-damaged patients actually experience fear, because if the amygdala, it sounds like it doesn't just create fear, but it kind of chooses whether or not you should be fearful. So if it's only getting information from the outside, then the patients who realize, okay, I'm not in a dangerous situation, I'm in a lab, they know what they're doing, I'm not going to die, they can be more, their amygdala can control that and inhibit it. But if there's no information from the external world for the other person going to the amygdala with the amygdala damage, they're not getting that, so they're not understanding this is a controlled situation and I don't have to be fearful.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's good.
It gets kind of, I thought someone had brought up in the discussion something about that the amygdala might kind of help you like learn, oh, this is just, you know, just for a second I'm not going to be able to breathe, this isn't a real danger. But if the amygdala is damaged, maybe that connection isn't made, so it's just like a threat to the body, but they don't understand, they can't comprehend what it is. The body doesn't, at least not right away, kind of interpret it correctly, so it seems much more fearful than for people that don't have the damage. They might initially panic a little bit, but then calm themselves down quickly.
So those of you who were, oh, you had a,
It's just, I'm not sure if this really fits in with what is being said, but would that possibly suggest that people who get frequent panic attacks may have some damage or problem with their amygdala?
it might, yeah.
In the article, it said that a lot of patients that have panic attacks.
Can you speak up?
Sorry, I don't so well. In the article, it said that a lot of patients that have panic attacks show atrophy to the amygdala. So I don't know how much research is out there on that, but they did imply that. The researchers implied that there's some sort of damage or less amygdala in patients that have panic attacks.
So, Amber, did you have, I mean, you guys who were, I think Maverick, Valerie, can't remember, Melissa, Amber, Jordan, and there's one other person.
Me.
Shayla. Okay. Oh, so that's too many people. Didn't I say, oh, well, anyway, you guys know who you are. So, let's just say, Shayla, what do you were about to, you had your hand up, so what were you about to contribute? Oh, you were just waving your hand around? Oh, sorry, maybe there's a fly or something. Okay. So you had just said something that, was that part of your question that you had in mind to contribute, or did you just think of that?
No, I remember that when you said it.
Okay.
And then your question, in the article it says that because they didn't show, because they were testing them before they gave them the inhalation, they didn't show any signs of fear or panic. But then the patients with the lesions were like drastically. After the test, it was like drastic. They said like it was like a sharp increase. And so then that's where they suggested that the amygdala might inhibit panic. So I think it was sort of seeing like, well, since they don't have that, and then their reaction is so much more severe than the patients who do, then maybe it has some sort of link. And then, so in my discussion, I talked about how Mary talked about the slow route and the fast route, and how it's sort of just like maybe that plays into it, because normally the fast route goes to the amygdala and then goes down and then sends like a quick response. But maybe there is some inhibition there, because you don't want to run from the coiled rope, you know, like she used the example of the snake or coiled rope. So then maybe that plays a part in it. So that was really what I found interesting.
See you guys. Okay, so let's try to make sense of this. So we have external fear stimuli, and we have internal. Can you guys see this? Not a very good pen. Okay, and then we have people who have amygdala damage, so that's NFG, and then we have amygdala OK. Those of you who don't know what NFG is, ask your neighbor. Okay, so what are we suggesting? That external fear stimuli are processed by the amygdala when it's there, And then what happens with that? So I'm going to say goes down here, and then what's the result? Determines whether it's appropriate to be scared or not, right? Yes, go ahead.
I don't know, my understanding of it is that amygdala like kind of regulates what you should be afraid of.
Yeah.
It kind of like recognizes the external and like the emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
And then the chemoreceptors kind of regulate the physiological response to fear that you should be doing.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of gives you a scared or not scared, no-go or no-go signal.
Yeah.
And then that then triggers some other processes that either generate perceived fear. God, this thing smells horrible. Or behavioral, like physiological responses. Physio fear. Okay, so we'll just use that as a shortcut for those responses. Okay, so then what's going on with the internal fear stimuli in the people who have an okay amygdala? Still going there. I need a different color crap. There's a blue one there. Okay. So internal. It's actually black. Here's another one. Somebody put a blue top on a black pen. That's just harsh. Okay, so the internal fear stimuli are going to a person with an okay amygdala, and then what happens there?
Yeah.
What would you think would be the normal result if a person with an amygdala in a vacuum couldn't breathe? What would you say?
They would feel fear,
They'd be scared.
but
Right.
just not as much, right?
Well, so the internal stimuli I would think would trigger fear. But if the external stimuli were telling them that it was not really anything they needed to worry about, so it's sort of like the amygdala would prevent fear in this case unless it was legit. Like if you were underwater when you got this feeling, the amygdala would not be telling you, don't worry about it, right? So it's kind of like you would normally, it would just be like a straight through to scared, but the amygdala can say no depending on the input from out here. Is that you're saying? That's what you're saying, right, Nick? Yeah, I'm doing a terrible job of diagramming this because it's totally on the fly. Okay. So normally, if you have your body is telling you you're suffocating, you would be scared. But if you're in a situation where you don't really need to worry about it, you don't get scared. If you are in a situation where you are in danger of suffocating, then you get scared. Rachel?
I was just gonna say, what if you add another, like, other external stimuli, and then that can converge to the amygdala?
Like-
And then if the other external stimuli is not telling your amygdala to be scared, then it converges to the not scared.
You're right. This shouldn't be a fear stimulant. This should be safety stimuli. Okay, so that, if the amygdala is getting to safety, I didn't stop at my office today, so I have really crappy pens. I apologize. So that, if it's getting a safety stimulus, then that would counteract this. This would be there, right? So this would be gone. And it would counteract this, so you wouldn't get fear. You'd get no fear. That was painful. If I can walk after this. Oh, yes. Oh, Amber.
Well, that was one of my questions for today, is for like the patients with amygdala damage,
Mm-hmm.
if you paired like a positive stimulus with that negative stimulus of inhaling the CO2, would it make a difference in like conditioning them to not feel that fear, or is it simply just like physiological? Does that make sense?
So this is all talking about what happens in people whose amygdala is okay, right? This is like what we'd expect normal people to go through. If they have a fear stimulus, they feel fear. If they have a safety stimulus at the same time they're getting this, then they don't feel fear. So this would lead to that. So what about people who don't have an amygdala? What happens when they have this internal fear stimulus? So we figure, okay, what's going to happen?
They're gonna panic.
Easily aroused. No, it's in my hand. Uh-oh, I don't even need that. Okay, so let's say those people are going to be scared because they're getting this fear stimulus. Okay? What if they're also getting this safety stimulus?
There's no de-escalation.
Yeah.
No de-escalation.
They don't have the ability to inhibit the fear, so they're still gonna have it.
They're still going to be scared. So it goes here. Okay? So that's what we're thinking for now. But isn't there evidence? So they have absolutely no reaction to external fear stimuli because they don't panic.
Yeah.
So the external fear stimuli then, obviously my coloring is completely effed up now. I don't know. So external fear stimuli doesn't work for them. They're still not scared. I think you were first.
So kind of, I don't remember your name, what she was saying about the fast route, slow route thing. And the amygdala is damaged. The amygdala is like the fast route, and then all the other processing that kind of goes on in the background is like the slow route. So with them, they have, wouldn't like the safety stimuli and would that safety stimuli be processed through the slow route, whereas the fear stimulus itself would be processed by the amygdala.
By both.
Or by both. So people who have a damaged amygdala, they're not getting that initial fear stimulus. So their external fear stimuli is only going through the slow route. So it allows them time to be reassured by the safety stimuli.
Except that the fact is that in this case, well, the external fear stimuli.
Right, the external.
Right.
So they weren't worried, or they weren't having that kind of initial fear while the researchers were hooking them up and preparing them for everything, because they had that safety stimuli going through that slower route. So they didn't have that initial kind of like elevated arousal as they're preparing for it.
Okay,
Whereas,
go ahead.
Okay. Whereas, because on the other side with the internal stimuli, maybe that's just like a feedback process that doesn't go through the amygdala, and maybe that's why they're still responding to it. Maybe.
Or it does go through the amygdala, but it can't be
processed the same because it's not like a recognition thing.
maybe this, well, but if the safety's, so there must be something, well, let's just go to Nick. You had your hand up.
I was just going to say, there was the same thing about I didn't feel any sort of anxiety or anything, or any panic when you're preparing them for the damage thing. But okay, because they did experience panic while they were setting them up there.
Okay, so let me just go through this again. So this is basically trying to figure out what the paper is telling you about something that you're trying to figure out. Okay, so we have two groups of people, the people with an amygdala and the people without. The people with an amygdala felt nervous beforehand. The people without an amygdala did not. The people with an amygdala were much less likely to panic with the internal fear stimuli, but the people without the amygdala were much more likely to panic with the internal fear stimuli, right? Okay, so the safety stimuli that were present in the environment seem to work for the people who have an amygdala, but did not work for the people who don't. Right?
I think the safety stimuli worked for the internal stimulus for the people with the amygdala, but the safety stimulus worked for the external stimulus for the people who didn't have an amygdala.
Okay, so that's very interesting.
Because
So maybe the deal then is the safety stimuli work for external stimuli for both groups, but for internal stimuli only for the people with an amygdala.
I wonder if maybe the amygdala has to do with just the potential for danger rather than being in danger. So this idea like it inhibits panic would be that if you're not able to see a potential for danger, then maybe you wouldn't feel panic leading up to something because you don't see the potential for the danger there. However, when they start to feel
When you're actually suffocating, you don't
there's-
need to see the potential because it's already occurring.
right.
Catherine?
I was just wondering how the thalamus takes part in this too, because of all the connections to get the processing of the whatever stimuli it was. I remember, at least from your last class, that there's a whole pathway that you take more of the slow and fast routes. And the thalamus was part of, I don't remember if it was part of the processing of it, but I don't know why I just thought of it now, that,
This one?
yeah, maybe there's a connection between the thalamus and the amygdala.
Oh, there definitely is. I mean, that's how that's the fast route. It's a direct connection between the thalamus and the amygdala. But, so a good question, oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, in my discussion question, I was kind of thinking about the same thing. Would it be that the stimulus goes directly to the thalamus, and then it takes the fast route to the amygdala, and then the external information is not being processed in the amygdala, so it's just kind of relying on the thalamus with that initial response of fear. And so if it goes to the slow route, the way I perceived it was that it can't go through the slow route because maybe some part of the amygdala is damaged. So it's literally just relying on that first initial response instead of being able to apply the next processed information.
So the question would be, one question at least would be, I'm now resorting back to the really lame pointer that I used to make in my other class. It's not going to work. These are too loose. Ah, there we go. Okay, so here's the whole amygdala. Okay, so first off, and this is something that we should think about, the amygdala is not just a single solid thing. It has multiple parts to it, and the different parts do different things. So here, there's 2 parts that have been separated, and actually there are something like 5 or 6 parts, but we're going to pretend we don't know that. And so information comes into this part of the amygdala, and then it goes here, and then this part of the amygdala is what takes care of the reactions, the fear, and activates the autonomic nervous system and everything. So your point might be maybe there's some kind of a breakdown in this connection too, because all of this information is, all of the safety stimuli and the fear stimuli, at least from the external world, are going to be coming in here. So maybe another question is there a different route going into the amygdala from the internal stimuli? So maybe that doesn't have to go through this at all. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. You said that all the external stimuli is going through the fast route?
No, it's just going to the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala. That part, it's going into that part. And then the amygdala does some fancy stuff on its own, I don't know what. And then then the information goes to this nucleus, but it's still the amygdala. And then axons come out of there and go to all these places that drive all these reactions. Like this is sympathetic adrenal medullary activation, so this is the panic feeling is going to come from this, and well, the sympathetic nervous system probably just included in this. thalamus. So this is where you're going to be getting that kind of reaction from your body. And then emotional behavior, that's, you know, the clutching and whatever that you would be doing if you were trying to breathe. So if external stimuli, we know external stimuli come in through the external sensory organs, and except for odor, go to the thalamus before it goes to the amygdala. So, but internal stimuli, actually, I don't really know what the connection is. Somebody else meant this. Who else is the, Shayla, do you have something to add right now? Like, is there anything that you thought about that would fit in with this? Oh, well, Valerie, go ahead.
You had mentioned that maybe there's another pathway that's not being considered, and in the research it did say that the ones with the amygdala damage felt like a connection was sparked between neurons that hadn't been sparked in a while, like that were dormant. Like it awoke certain connections that were.
Do you know what? Can you remember what that is? Valerie, can you remember what part that was in? Because I just don't remember that.
It's on page 3.
Page 3. Okay. Can you read it? Does anybody have it?
I highlighted it.
Do you have it?
So it's at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Saying finally the defects reported being survived.
This suggests that the high concentration of inhaled CO2 activated a pathway that had remained mostly dormant up until the point of the experiment. That's great. Hey, now guess what? New experience. Panic attacks. Yay! So we don't know. I mean, they're not really speculating about what the pathway would be, right?
Right. Get depth of that.
They did say something about the epidermis, I thought. They mentioned some structure that might be like part of the.
So one thing that I could think of is there might be reciprocal pathways. You know, the brainstem or the nucleus is going to activate the brainstem nuclei that run this stuff, but there may be sensory neurons going this way that would activate. It's just not in this diagram. Yeah.
I found where they were speculating about the pathways. So it says, in contrast, CO2 acts internally at acid-activated chemoreceptors and causes an array of physiological changes. Thus, CO2 might engage interoceptive afferent sensory pathways that project to the brainstem, diencephalon, and insular cortex.
And then those, so basically saying that we have, for example, we have oxygen sensors in various places in our bloodstream that tell us, you know, you need to breathe. And then those signals would be afferent sensory signals, and they would come in on the autonomic nervous system internal sensory neurons that are called visceral afferent neurons, if you remember that, so into the brainstem. And then, so they're basically saying that this would be activating these other reactions, maybe without needing this, or maybe with only needing this part, in case this part is the part that's broken. So one of the things, Jordan, go ahead.
Well, it was kind of like a question. So could it be that instead of the fast or the slow route, these people who have the lesions, like there are new pathways that are created like specifically almost for them because they don't have the other pathways that then allow for the fear, like all the different chemoreceptors and all the different things that could almost create alternate pathways that maybe touch on certain things within these routes, but completely different than what somebody who would have, say,
or maybe everyone has those pathways, but we just aren't really aware of them most of the time.
So, like, those ones are almost dormant to the point where we never use them, but because these people don't have the initial routes, or even the first and second route, they kind of go to the tertiary route.
Yeah, and I wonder if a person who had, you know, like if you had really severe brain damage, if you take air away from a person, I wonder how bad the brain damage has to be before they don't start gasping and their heart doesn't start beating and they don't start freaking out. So my guess actually is that there are pathways that would trigger those reactions automatically, which I think is what Nick was saying, right? That it doesn't really have to go through the amygdala to trigger this. It's more of a brainstem, localized brainstem reflexes. So the physiological reaction, that makes a lot of sense. But the thing that is, I think that the authors of the study were really trying to address is that feeling of fear, because there's a lot of disagreement and misunderstanding, or I should say lack of understanding in neuroscience about what triggers subjective feelings anyway. And one of the candidates has been activation in the amygdala somewhere. And so what they're kind of trying to say here is that apparently you don't need the amygdala to have the feeling of fear. Maybe we've known before that you didn't need it to have the physiological reactions, but evidently the feeling is also generated somewhere outside. Yeah, Maverick.
Yeah, so that was kind of my question with like the pH receptor.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's more pH receptors in other parts of the brain,
Mm-hmm.
not the amygdala?
Yeah, they're in the hypothalamus, lots of them. Yeah.
So maybe that's why.
But where does that feeling, so the question is that if it's not the amygdala, what do we think about where the subjective experience is coming from of fear? Yes.
Well, I don't see why it has to come from one certain place. I feel like it's kind of like you group together all this evidence. Like you can sweat and have your heart beat fast and be breathing really hard, but if you're exercising, you're not going to feel fearful. But since these people are getting the same clues, the people with amygdala damage are getting the same clues as the people without it, but except for the external
Safety,
yeah.
The external safety.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like the people without amygdala damage can put together the clues. I don't think that requires like one location. I feel like
not one, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the entire subjective experience of fear would depend on your perception of your physiological responses.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? So what do you guys think about that? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about it as like with the hippocampus and form memories, and can decipher between what's actually going to be fearful or not. And so how does that affect people who have amygdala damage? Because it said in the article that they ran this study multiple times so that they could see if they created a memory for it and recognized it.
Favor Jordan because he hasn't said as much.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, is there going to be a significant difference in males versus females? Because, like, all the people in the study were female.
Oh, that's an interesting question, too.
There's always, like, those little differences in fear responses and how much fear you experience in males versus females. So I was wondering, like, is there going to be a significant difference? Or because they have these amygdala lesions, is it going to be along the same lines of that response?
So does everybody hear the question? So what would you speculate would be a pathway by which we might expect to see sex differences in this type of phenomenon? Let me say that differently, not just the pathway per se, but what feature do we know about human beings that might lead to a difference in when fear is triggered or how it's triggered? Yeah.
I think men might be way more intense than women just because, primitively speaking, the men were the providers, the protectors.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, maybe whatever their reaction is might be way more intense than a woman's.
So you're suggesting that there may be some pathways that have developed differently in men and women based on their roles in society back when we had really sort of more division of labor kind of thing. So Shayla, yeah.
It would be the opposite. I think women would have more of a panic attacks than males.
More, well, not panic attacks per se, but just fear, stronger fear.
Yeah. I feel like we constantly worry about things, so I feel like it would be more females.
He was first, but then you. Mavericks?
the pituitary gland, since it releases hormones, and girls and boys are different hormones?
Well, it could be, but I'm kind of trying to get at the idea of why you'd think there'd be a sex difference to begin with. Because one thing you'll learn if you stay in psychology is you can't propose a sex difference without a reason, or else you're going to get in deep trouble. Okay? So
take it back.
It's like, no, it's okay. I'm not a researcher that's going to write a nasty editorial about you. So, yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe, because men are supposed to kind of like be almost like less fearful in society, that maybe if something like the CO2 challenge were to be given to them, maybe it would take longer for them to get to that response, but kind of almost combining both of the thoughts, it might be almost more intense because it's almost built up and then like prolonged, and once it gets to that response, it kind of hits more full force, so kind of a combination. So it does impact more, but it also is delayed, like just a possibility.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a second, Andrea.
I would think that if we saw sex differences, it might be along the lines of like the sensory perception, because we know there are sex differences in how men and women perceive things, like spatial awareness and attention and things like that. So I would think it would be in those pathways.
So you're thinking it would be somewhere in this whole sensory aspect of it. There also are sex differences in the size and development of the amygdala itself. I think it's in young men or young boys have bigger amygdalas than young girls, but then over time it changes the other way around, or it could be vice versa, right? Because this again is like deep archives that I'm trying to find. So what we're proposing here, if we're just to summarize these contributions, it's like if in evolutionary history it was helpful in some way for there to be a sex difference in the way the fear response is triggered, then the system would have evolved in such a way that sex hormones would alter the connections among all of these things in some way, so that they would develop slightly differently in men and women. And what I've heard is possible reasons why you would expect both sexes to be stronger. So there are plausible reasons, from what I've heard, that you could make the case that you would expect one to be stronger versus the other one to be stronger. So this is a good lesson in evolutionary psychology. So one of the things about evolutionary psychology is that you can think of a plausible evolutionary reason for damn near anything, if you think about it. So that's one of the criticisms of it. So we can't go back and test, unfortunately. Like we can't go back to 2 million years ago and look at the Australopithecines and see which ones were the scaredest. Yeah.
In my discussion too, I also thought about maybe there's two different processes as far as fear goes. Like the amygdala one is like, okay, there's still a chance, there's still a way we can get around this, let's think about it, blah, blah, blah. And once it becomes a physiological thing, it's like the body realizes, okay, mayday, shut down. Because didn't it say something like there's like your neural activity goes down once the CO2 hits? So it's like... I
don't remember that either. But that doesn't mean it doesn't say that.
Right.
I've had a lot in my brain right now. So let me ask a question that I see as being a fundamental question. Do you think this study proves in any way that you don't need your amygdala in order to experience subjective feelings of fear? So you've had your hand up so many times, I feel bad.
Well, so I wanted to mention that the internal route is that it stimulates the brainstem, and then that the brainstem can stimulate those reactions. I was wondering for like disseparate animals if they're able to experience fear in any way, because they have their automatic, like when stimulated, they'll do hissing, biting, growling. So is that, is it because there's some sort of external, or there's some sort of stimulus that at some level they fear,
or they feel fear,
Mhm.
which would trigger those reactions. Because the brainstem is kind of like that most basic level of processing. So if that's where the internal stimulus is going, if it's skipping this other route and it's going directly to the brainstem, at the brainstem level, are we able to invoke some sort of feeling of fear? And then our cerebrum is what processes those subjective feelings.
Mhm.
So maybe it's triggered by the brainstem,
Mhm.
but then the subjective experience is, processed by
Or generated by.
Yeah.
That's the question. And I think that summarizes kind of what has been suggested, is that it's coming from a different spot, at least in these people.
Because from this route, it goes from the amygdala to the brainstem, and from the internal route, it goes directly into the brainstem.
So what you'd have is, somehow or other, you'd have an internal stimulus triggering all of this stuff, which either in this area or through connections with another area that we don't have diagrammed is generating that subjective experience.
Right. So if the external stimuli goes through the amygdala and then to the brainstem, which is where we maybe have that subjective fear, and because the people who had amygdala damage didn't feel fear from the external stimuli.
No, but they felt plenty of fear from the internal.
Which is
So,
maybe going
so
to
that's
the
my
brainstem.
question is, do you need your amygdala to feel fear? What do you think?
By subjective fear, do you mean like, based on experience, or like how you like?
I mean that feeling. When, let's say you walk into your house at night, it's dark, you open the door, you go in, you put the keys down, and you hear something in the room that doesn't sound like any sound you've ever heard before. That feeling, like,
Doesn't that come from cortisol?
no,
No.
definitely not from cortisol. That's a slower response. But the question is, well, there's a zillion questions. This is the thing about emotion. It's like the prime argument in emotion research for years was whether there is anything about fear that isn't just feeling your physiological responses. But for me, like, obviously there is, because as you said, if you can have the same physiological responses from a different stimulus and not feel fear. So I think there is a subjective experience that is distinct to fear, or fear-ish. So let's just pretend there is one so that we can not argue about that, because that's a separate argument. And so all of you who are on deck today, Maverick, let's see, Andrea, Amber, Jordan, and Naomi and Shayla, what do you guys think this study says about that? Does it tell us that you don't need your amygdala to feel fear or not? And kind of why? So I'll start with you, Maverick, since you're not afraid.
Yeah, I would say that you wouldn't need it to feel fear.
You say you don't need it.
Yeah, but aren't there two amygdalas?
Yes, but they have bilateral
Oh,
calcifications. Yeah.
Sorry, just one thing. I just found another study where they were dealing with the same disease,
Mhm.
and they were all female again. Don't know if that's that I think should. But all of them only had basolateral amygdala damage. So they don't really say in here
whether they have
the
central
entire amygdala. So
well, let's just
putting
that aside. Let's say, all right, now, or even taking that into account. So, do you need your basolateral amygdala to experience subjective fear? And Shayla, do you have a vote?
Say no. I don't know if that was wrong.
Okay. What about you?
I would think actually yes, because they weren't able to feel the external fear stimuli, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what about you?
I think from the article's perspective, they're saying that you don't necessarily need it.
Pretty much the same, based off of
Same thing. What about you?
I think that you do need it in a sense, because they talked about how people with damage, and they ran all of these tests to induce fear on them, and it didn't affect them. Like, even I think it's
So you're saying,
life-threatening.
So basically, what we have is two sides. People who come down on the side that you don't need it to feel fear because people who didn't have it felt fear and reported fear. And the other side is saying you do need it to feel fear because the people who didn't have it weren't able to feel fear in appropriate situations, right? So there's one other thing to say about this, which is these people are not normal, okay? So we can't just do an isolated lesion of the amygdala in human beings to see whether we need it to feel a particular thing. And we don't know what other connections are broken in these folks. So I feel like we can't make a strong case, but we can make a decent case that you don't need the amygdala to feel the subjective feeling of fear per se, but mostly maybe you do use it for that, but you don't have to have it. But that's just where I come down on it. Did you have a last thing to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I was part of that group and you excluded me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgot there were so many of you.
I just wanted to say that I think it is necessary because, like a case, the more facts you have, the better judgment you can make. So as far as survival goes, you would definitely need it to make better judgment.
Yeah, it's a useful thing. So, all right, so obviously we've managed to keep going until the end of time. And we didn't even need some of these questions that people submitted, but I want you to submit them anyway, because I think the fact that you thought about all of this enough to write them made this good. Okay, I also noticed that there were several people in here who did not say a word, and that's okay, but you need to be able to speak up. It's a good skill to learn in life, so, you know, good. All right, so now we have one more minute. What do you think? Was this a good thing? Did I talk too much? Did I take over too much from her because I could see that I wanted things to direct things? Did you like that? Do you want me to do it differently? Do you guys want to do it differently? Speak up quickly. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for compliments.
I personally, the discussions, like I read those last night when I was at work, and that made me think about different aspects of it, but then I didn't really have time to like really think about it, so they were posted a little bit earlier.
So, okay, so Marin is saying that she would have liked to have the discussion questions even earlier so that she could have thought about them more. And a thing that I realized because of the way we're doing the class, you know, I'm kind of a dinosaur, so I haven't really used the internet that much in my classes. If we make you post them earlier, then other people can see them and they can think about them too. So when we actually come in and do this, we'll have more to say to each other. Obviously, I need to get it together and post the article sooner. And I'm really impressed that you guys did this well with me only posting the article like on Tuesday. That's great. So obviously people cared and you know, did something about it, so that makes me very happy. So do you want to keep doing it this way for at least a couple more times and see how it goes?
Yeah, that was a good approach.
And maybe I'll put, well, we already have the article Nick's going to do is up there already, so maybe could you turn in, when do you want them would it help to have them more than a day, or? So maybe on Sunday, turn them in by Sunday?
Sunday afternoon?
Whatever.
Okay.
And that way you'll have all day Monday to look them over instead of just one night. And I'm gonna, yeah, that's a word. I'm going to find articles or help Eric and Sally find articles which we'll post sooner, but I don't know how much sooner because it's kind of hard to find good articles. Okay.